Imagine for a second that you are standing in a neighborhood in Sweden.
Right. And the mental image that comes to mind is, well, it's usually a cliche, isn't it?
It is. You think of stability, high trust, safety,
Yeah.
The quiet order of a social welfare state.
It's often presented as the gold standard of the Western liberal dream, the model for everyone else.
But then you zoom in. You look at the reality for a resident living near the Säve district in Malmö.
And suddenly that postcard image starts to fracture.
It really does. While you have politicians in Brussels and media pundits debating the semantics of whether no-go zones are a real concept or just some kind of construct.
This resident is looking out his window at something that, frankly, belongs in a war zone, not Scandinavia.
Exactly. He's not seeing the vibrancy he was promised. He describes watching a hand grenade being thrown into a house, a murder taking place on the very next block.
And at that point, it just stops being an abstract political debate, doesn't it?
It has to. Especially when you look at the hard data. I mean, last year, this supposed model of peace recorded 149 bombings.
An all-time high. And we have to be clear what we're talking about here. This isn't petty crime or, economic desperation.
No, we are talking about military explosives and what the country's own former police chief called terrorist-like violence.
That massive disconnect between the utopian theory of open borders pushed by the elites and what's actually visible on the street, this low-intensity warfare, it's jarring.
It is. And it forces a terrifying question. How does a civilization go from one of the safest places on Earth to a state of internal fragmentation in a single generation?
Is this just a catastrophic policy accident? Or is it, as we're about to explore, something more like the slow-motion suicide of an entire continent?
Welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to trace that harrowing observation that a major civilization is undergoing a rapid internal fragmentation right back to its intellectual foundations and its policy failures.
And the sources we're looking at, they don't pull any punches. They ask these terrifying questions about the very nature of modern European identity.
You really do. And they use that stark language, slow-motion suicide, to describe what they see as the consequence of elite policy choices. We'll be tracing the philosophical roots of post-national identity and following that pathway right to the fractured societies and compromised institutions visible on the streets of Europe today.
To really get to the heart of it, though, we first have to understand the sheer scale of the demographic change Europe has gone through. It's the backdrop for everything else.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's unpack that.
Yeah.
What did this massive demographic shift actually look like?
Well, the scale of modern migration flows into Europe it's foundational to this entire discussion. If you look at the data from the early 2010s, the foreign-born population in major European states was consistently high.
We're talking around 10 to 20%.
Often between 10 and 20%, yes. But here's the thing. That number dramatically underestimates the actual demographic shift.
Right, because it's only counting first-generation immigrants, people who were born elsewhere.
Precisely. To get the true picture, you have to look at the total population with an immigrant background. So that's the foreign-born plus their native-born children, what sociologists call the second generation.
And once you include them, the numbers.
Yeah.
They must jump quite a bit.
They leap. We saw the population with an immigrant background stabilize around 19% in the UK, 20% in Germany and the Netherlands.
So about 1 in 5 people.
Yes, but it got even more striking in other countries. In France, the figure reached 26%. And then you have Scandinavia and the Low Countries, where it climbed to a really striking 28% in Sweden and 30% in Belgium.
30%, that's nearly a third of the population.
We are talking about rapid, massive shifts in national composition within a single generation. And this unprecedented diversity and the political and cultural friction it caused, it just created the perfect environment for new political movements to emerge.
And that takes us directly into our first segment, the ideological roots of fragmentation. So while governments were struggling to manage this diversity through policy, either assimilation or multiculturalism, a really powerful counter-movement emerged. We're talking about the pan-European nationalist movement known as Identitarianism, which launched a direct and, I think, profound critique of the entire post-national project.
What's so fascinating about identitarianism is how it frames the conflict. It positions itself not just as another political movement, but as a kind of defense mechanism.
A defense against what, exactly?
Against what it views as an existential threat to white European identity. They claim this identity is under a systematic assault from multiculturalism, the homogenizing forces of globalization, and most critically, from mass immigration.
So they're essentially claiming cultural self-defense, but this isn't based on, crude historical political rhetoric. They're drawing on a pretty deep intellectual lineage, right?
Absolutely. The movement consciously connects itself to the history of European reactionary thought. They draw heavily from the interwar period's conservative revolution and, more directly, from the French Nouvelle Droite, the New Right, which gained prominence starting in the 1960s.
And they cite specific figures.
Oh, yes. Intellectual architects like Alain de Benoit and Guillaume Fay are cited as major ideological sources. It provides a highly developed, almost academic-sounding basis for their views.
So this is a movement trying to legitimize its arguments intellectually, trying to distinguish itself from, say, historical groups often associated with fascism or Nazism. They see themselves as the post-industrial far right.
That's the framing, yes.
So what's their strategy for gaining influence? How do they plan to get these ideas into the mainstream?
Their strategy is defined as metapolitical. Their primary goal is not immediate parliamentary success, not like traditional political parties.
So it's not about winning the next election.
Not at all. Instead, they aim to conquer the key institutions of intellectual influence, cultural organizations, media, academia, to fundamentally reframe the entire public discourse around identity and immigration.
So you shift the intellectual climate first.
Exactly. By shifting the climate, they believe that political action will follow naturally later on.
That's a highly sophisticated long-term strategy. It's about shifting the Overton window by introducing concepts that sound almost academic, but carry this immense political freight. So let's look at those core concepts they use to achieve this ideological shift.
There are three key concepts, and they're all designed to challenge the dominant liberal vision of globalization and open societies. The first one is ethno-pluralism.
Ethno-pluralism. It sounds technical. What does it actually mean?
It's the belief that the world should be structured into distinct, separate, ethnically related ethnospheres.
Which sounds like a very sophisticated defense of segregation. What's the practical takeaway for, the average person who encounters this idea?
Well, the core takeaway is that the movement sells segregation not as a traditional racial hierarchy, but almost as a form of planetary environmentalism.
Wait, environmentalism. How do they make that connection?
They argue that cultures are like endangered species that have to be kept separate in their natural habitats to survive. If you mix them, they say, they homogenize, and the world loses its cultural biodiversity.
Wow.
This rhetorical maneuver allows them to avoid the charges of racism that are usually leveled against segregationist movements.
So they're positioning their separatist ideology as a form of cultural preservation. That is an incredibly powerful rhetorical shift away from the traditional language of the far right.
It is a very subtle and powerful reframing, and this ties directly into their second core concept, pan-European nationalism.
Okay, so what does that entail?
Well, they reject the traditional nation-state, which they see as a failed inheritance of the French Revolution's universalist, and to them, dubious philosophy. Instead, they envision a new kind of Europe.
What would that look like?
They want a Europe of 100 flags. A mosaic of diverse regional communities that retain their deep, localized sense of belonging, what the Germans call Heimat.
100 flags.
Yeah.
So they want to break up existing countries.
Into smaller, more culturally organic regions, yes. And these communities would be united not by bureaucratic rule from Brussels, but by a shared, single European civilizational heritage, defined by shared historical and cultural roots.
That concept of Heimat seems central here, doesn't it? It's not just homeland. It carries a much deeper, more emotional resonance.
It does. Heimat refers to a deep-rooted sense of belonging tied to a specific local place, a culture, a history. It's a powerful critique aimed directly at the perceived rootlessness and placelessness of modern globalization and the sterile bureaucratic governance coming from the EU.
So they're arguing that regional cultures, which they see as the true source of European identity, are being crushed by both centralized power and mass immigration.
Precisely. And tying all these concepts together, providing the urgent narrative, is the central ideological pivot, the Great Replacement.
Right. The conspiracy theory.
Correct. This is the theory that European white identity is being systematically replaced by non-European peoples, often through deliberate state-backed migration policies. And the sources are clear that this is not just some academic theory floating around.
No, it has real-world consequences.
Horrific consequences. This ideology was explicitly adopted by the perpetrator of the Christchurch mosque shootings, who actually donated money to identitarian groups. It demonstrates a clear, tragic link between this metapolitical theory and radical, violent action.
It really shows how powerful ideas, however niche they seem, can filter down and connect a high-level intellectual critique directly to tragedy. Now, this intense ideological pressure from the far right, it coincided with a striking political backlash from the mainstream, too. We saw high-profile denouncements of multiculturalism from leaders like David Cameron in the UK and Angela Merkel in Germany.
Yes, the mainstream political class started publicly acknowledging that the policy of multiculturalism had failed, but this denouncement, it revealed a profound policy paradox.
A paradox inherent in multiculturalism as a prescription for managing diversity.
Exactly. It sought to recognize and celebrate differences, but it often ended up institutionalizing and constraining them, which just led to more fragmentation.
How exactly did recognition lead to fragmentation? I mean, if the goal was to make people feel seen, why did it end up pushing them apart?
It comes down to how the state defined the groups. Multicultural policy institutionalized diversity by placing people into these rigid, often singular ethnic and cultural boxes.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Think about government funding or recognition only going to centralized umbrella group community centers based on nationality or religion. So, for example, treating all Muslims or all North Africans as one single homogeneous community with a single set of representatives.
So to put that in simple terms for someone listening, the state basically used policy to create separate centralized lobbying groups defined by ethnicity.
Exactly. And this institutionalization inadvertently led to what one scholar termed plural monoculturalism.
Plural monoculturalism. I like that.
It's good, isn't it? Instead of individual blending, you ended up with distinct, uniform cultures existing side by side, competing for resources and political access. And these cultures often formed based on the very criteria the state itself was using for funding and recognition.
Which meant that to access any kind of political representation or resources, individuals had to primarily identify with their umbrella group.
Precisely.
So the state unintentionally eroded the common national identity, the shared civic space that was supposed to hold society together.
Yes. It focused political attention and resource distribution on ethnicity rather than on need or individual citizenship. And the consequence was it created the very divisions it was meant to manage, leading to alienated minorities and societies defined by parallel structures rather than shared ones.
Which brings us squarely into the mechanics of assimilation failure in the European context, which is our segment 2, the assimilation divide. And there's a fascinating contrast here with the United States. Sociological studies are pretty clear that assimilation is a complex process. It depends on balancing blending and segregating dynamics. But the key barriers to incorporation on either side of the Atlantic are radically different.
They really are. In North America, the sources show the key institutional challenge is primarily a lack of legal status.
So being undocumented.
Exactly. Undocumented status creates this perpetual state of fear and avoidance fear of deportation, which causes immigrants to shun mainstream institutions. They avoid healthcare, social services, even the police.
So the barrier is systemic and legal. It's the state's law enforcement mechanism.
It is, and it creates high social costs, especially for groups like undocumented Mexican and Central American immigrants. But in Western Europe, the barrier is fundamentally different and often more profound.
How?
The most prominent social factor complicating incorporation is religious difference, specifically that stark Muslim-non-Muslim distinction. The hurdles in Europe involve belonging to a cultural nation, whereas in the U.S., incorporation is primarily about belonging to a political state through law.
Right. And the historical European expectation, particularly in secular countries like France and Germany, was that strong religious identity would just naturally fade, or at least be relegated to the private sphere over generations, following the path of Italian or Polish Catholic immigrants.
But the opposite seems to have happened in many Muslim communities.
Yeah.
We observe this remarkable phenomenon, the persistence and, in some cases, the resurgence of strong religious culture among second-generation Muslim immigrants. And this is even against the strong normative pressure toward secularism in Europe. Studies noted this religious resurgence in the Netherlands. In France, Muslims remain substantially more religious than comparable natives, regardless of their ethnic origins.
And the numbers back this up, right?
The numbers are compelling. Almost 1/3 of adult Turks in Germany regularly attend mosque. Now, that's a higher rate than you find in many other Turkish diaspora communities, or even in large parts of Turkey itself.
So the pressure to secularize is being met with a kind of internal cultural doubling down.
It is, and this persistence isn't random. The research points clearly to parental socialization and social control playing a key role. Religiosity and associated norms like traditional attitudes toward gender equality and homosexuality are effectively transmitted from the first generation to the second.
And these norms are preserved through cultural maintenance, reinforced within these dense, homogeneous social networks. So what you get is a two-sided predicament for young people growing up in these communities. They're being pulled inward culturally by the family network, but also pushed outward by the host society's expectations.
Precisely. On one side, you have internal cultural maintenance, using subtle social control gossip, community pressure, to preserve cultural traits like marriage practices or gender norms. On the other side, the external environment actively engages in religious discrimination.
And this discrimination is often driven by a genuine belief among natives that certain Muslim norms are inherently incompatible with modern European values, especially around gender or secular life.
It is. And the data supports the idea that this isn't just a thinly veiled ethnic bias, right? Audit studies confirm it's a specific religious discrimination.
They do.
Yes. Audit studies, for instance, in France, show that a unique religious discrimination exists against Muslims, even when you control rigorously for regional or ethnic origins.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, for example, if two resumes are identical in every single way except for a subtle indication of religious adherence, the one signaling a Muslim identity receives significantly fewer callbacks. So when the native population stigmatizes these cultural beliefs, which are, at the same time, integral to the immigrant community's cohesion, it creates a truly destructive feedback loop.
It sounds like a sociological mechanism for guaranteeing division rather than blending.
That is the core insight. It's encapsulated in Proposition 3 from the source material. When cultural beliefs integral to immigrant cohesion are stigmatized by natives, cultural difference and social closure between the groups are likely to co-evolve.
Social closure. So they close ranks.
They close ranks. And that reinforces residential and relational segregation. In other words, the fear or prejudice the natives held that these groups wouldn't integrate became the very thing the minority groups had to build, social closure, in order to survive the stigma.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of separation. The host society labels the community as other, which compels the community to retreat inward and reinforce its identity markers for solidarity, which then just validates the original native stigmatization.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
And this cycle of exclusion and reinforcement leads us directly to segment 3, where we see how two major European powers, France and Germany, attempted two totally divergent policy paths, but somehow achieved a convergent failure of exclusion.
The contrast between France and Germany it's a textbook case of how historical national ideology severely limited their ability to integrate Muslim populations effectively, despite these vastly different approaches.
Okay, let's start with France. They operate under the civic assimilationist model. This model is rooted in just a solid citizenship based on territory and the strict state secularism known as laïcité.
Right. The French model, which is deeply influenced by the revolutionary tradition, defines the state in political and contractual terms. It assumes that true assimilation requires immigrants to shed all alien characteristics and privatize their religion completely.
So no public displays of religion.
The state actively combats any visible form of regional, ethnic, or religious identity that might dilute the citizens' direct loyalty to the Republic.
And then, across the Rhine, Germany historically championed the exact opposite. The ethnic differentialist model, based on just sanguineous citizenship through blood ties.
Exactly. Germany historically defined itself in ethnocultural terms, often identifying as Christian Occidental. So when the first massive wave of immigrants arrived, primarily Turks, they were treated strictly as Gastarbeiter.
Guest workers.
Guest workers. Temporary ones under the explicit assumption they would eventually return to Turkey. And this assumption of impermanence meant that for decades, Germany felt no obligation to develop any coherent policies to permanently incorporate Islam or the Muslim population.
That myth of return led directly to the failure we see in the German parallel society today.
It did. Since no integration infrastructure was ever developed, it resulted in this massive ethnic and social class stratification that became permanent when the guest workers inevitably stayed.
And the socioeconomic outcomes were pretty bad.
Devastating. Turkish populations face systemic institutional stumbling blocks, particularly in education. The German tracking system often directs Turkish youth toward vocational schools very early on, regardless of their aptitude.
And the result of that educational tracking?
The result was extremely high rates of unskilled Turkish youth unemployment. Analysis at the time found rates hovering around 40%.
3%.
Which was 5 times higher than the equivalent German youth unemployment rate.
And I imagine their social life only reinforces this isolation.
The insularity is staggering. We're talking about nearly 3/4 of Turkish residents living in extensive ethnic enclaves. And these are not just residential areas. They're like mini cities with Turkish shops, services, and professionals, which reduces the need to ever interact with the broader German society.
And media plays a role too,
A
right?
huge role. This high reliance on transnational media is key to maintaining that cultural bubble. Reports indicated that 40% of Turks watched only Turkish TV and 55% read only Turkish newspapers.
So this sustained cultural maintenance meant that many young Turks found themselves proficient in neither High German nor High Turkish.
Exactly. They were caught in the middle, magnifying their linguistic disadvantage in the labor market and confining them to the lowest rung of unskilled work.
And so the result is a cycle. Exclusion compels the community to mobilize politically through its own organizations, groups like DIGAB and Milli Grus.
And then these organizations, they step in to provide essential services the German state won't or can't. They effectively create a powerful, parallel traditional Turkish society that mirrors the state's structures, but exists entirely outside its direct influence. The exclusion unintentionally empowered the very separate structures the state chose to ignore.
Okay, so now let's turn to France, which rejected multiculturalism in principle, but somehow achieved the same segregated result through its hardline assimilationist policies. This is the French assimilationist paradox.
It's a huge paradox. Despite the Republican ideal of colorblind, universal citizenship, France achieved de facto ethnic segregation. And this was often state-sponsored ghettoization in the urban periphery, known as the banlieues or sensitive urban zones.
These massive, isolated post-war housing projects.
Characterized by high density, poor maintenance, and profound socioeconomic disadvantage.
And this long-term marginalization, it just boiled over in the 2005 riots. The sources characterize this violence not as an expression of religious fundamentalism, but as a cry for recognition, driven primarily by social and economic blockages.
The economic deprivation was intense. Unemployment for youth in those sensitive zones was between 30 and 40%, often more than double the national average.
And on top of that, there was documented institutional racism.
Yes, where corporate hiring managers openly discriminated based on foreign-sounding names, or even just the postal codes from notorious suburbs like the Neuchâtel 93.
There was that one statistic that was just unbelievable, the one comparing university graduates.
That one forces you to pause. 5% unemployment for French-named university graduates versus over 26% for French university graduates with Muslim names.
So you do everything right. You get a degree from a French university. But the system is still completely blocked for you. We're not just talking about economics. We're talking about a complete blockage of the social contract for second-generation citizens.
Exactly. When a system denies upward mobility to its own educated citizens, it generates a deep existential resentment. And the irony is that fundamentalist organizations were powerless to stop the violence. They issued fatwas against the rioting that were just ignored.
Which suggests a lack of religious influence over the rioters, who were predominantly Muslim but not necessarily religious.
It suggests the problem was civic alienation, not religious fanaticism.
And this resentment became channeled into identity politics, frequently symbolized by the headscarf controversy. The veil controversy, which became a political flashpoint back in 1989, ended up serving as the central metaphor for separation.
And the political response in France shifted dramatically. Initially, there was a degree of tolerance under Mitterrand, recognizing le droit à la différence, the right to difference.
But that didn't last.
No. As political forces like the National Front gained ground and tensions rose, the state adopted an increasingly hardline, restrictive stance. And this culminated in the 2004 ban on conspicuous religious symbols in public schools.
The official rationale was to protect state neutrality and laïcité, to enforce an immutable pillar of the French Republic.
Right.
But what were the deeper, less discussed motivations underpinning such a sweeping ban?
Well, the policy, while rationalized through the language of universalism, undeniably reflected a historical colonial view of Muslims as lesser people whose practices needed to be controlled.
And fear, too, presumably.
And a profound, heightened fear of violence and terrorism following incidents in the 1990s. For many French citizens and politicians, the perception became a simplistic, corrosive equation. Headscarf equals visible Islam equals potential terrorism.
So by constantly labeling French-born citizens of North African origin as Muslim or immigrant, even though the majority were second-generation citizens with French passports, the state performed a political act of casting them as the other.
And that leads to the final damaging outcome: political disengagement and radicalization. When individuals feel trapped and excluded, they turn to collective action or strong identity markers for belonging.
And the sources suggest that both radical Islamism and racist populism are, in a sense, twin expressions of this similar social disengagement.
In an era where the politics of ideology have devolved into the politics of identity, the state's attempt to enforce a homogeneous identity paradoxically created the perfect conditions for radical separation.
That failure to protect core populations, both native and immigrant, or to hold institutions accountable for their duty, it reaches its most corrosive point when we look at the breakdown of institutional trust. This brings us to segment 4.
And this segment is crucial for understanding the state's internal compromise. It focuses on cases where institutional focus, driven by political optics or fear of controversy, directly compromised public safety implementation.
The Rotherham child sexual exploitation scandal in the UK is a devastating, multi-layered case study. It spans nearly 2 decades, from 1997 to 2015.
And the sources are clear this involved terrible things on a significant scale. We need to unpack not just the crime, but the institutional mechanism that allowed it to continue systematically for 18 years.
The shocking element is the institutional failure and the documented cover-up. We know from the subsequent inquiries that multiple reports published long before the scandal erupted publicly had already confirmed the dire situation.
Specifically, the Home Office and the Comprehensive Heal reports, published back in 2003 and 2006, had already confirmed widespread links between CSE, drugs, guns, and organized criminality within the borough of Rotherham.
So the authorities knew. They had specific reports detailing organized crime, yet they failed to act effectively for over a decade. Why the paralysis?
There was a documented, almost willful blindness. Following those 2006 Heal reports, the initial findings were actually argued to be exaggerated by local police and council officials.
Seriously?
Yes. This compelled the police to commission further evaluation, which simply reconfirmed the dire findings. The sources indicate that the inaction stemmed from a combination of political fear and a really distorted sense of priorities.
And then when the full story finally broke, the political focus immediately narrowed to blaming specific individuals.
Yes. Following the 2015 inquiry, the public and media discourse was fixated entirely on blaming local officials for willful neglect. And this narrative was convenient because it simplified the problem. It avoided any examination of the larger structural failures that created the conditions for this disaster.
It turned a systemic national problem into a local government failure. But the sources suggest there are huge questions that the official discourse just refused to entertain.
Absolutely. The inquiry focused on an ethic of justice, apportioning blame and emphasizing formal rules, instead of an ethic of care, which would emphasize context, empathy, and systemic support.
So rhetorical questions about the wider context, like why did central government withdraw their resources due to austerity? Or where was the political support for social work budgets under intense national pressure? Those questions were just absent.
Largely absent from the official inquiry's analysis, yes. And the failure wasn't isolated. It was compounded by a preceding public safety crisis that warped institutional priorities nationwide. We have to look at the immense public hysteria surrounding the death of Peter Connolly, or Baby P, in 2007 and 2008.
Right. That case was everywhere.
It generated unprecedented media scrutiny and political vilification of social workers and local councils across the UK. Local authorities, including Rotherham, witnessed public condemnations and professional ruin. And this pressure created an intense climate of fear that dictated resource allocation.
So to avoid another high-profile tragedy like Baby P,
resources were disproportionately focused very narrowly on children under the age of 5.
that seems like a logical, if panicked, reaction. But how did that disproportionate focus directly compromise the victims in the Rotherham case?
Because the victims in the Rotherham CSE scandal were primarily older, vulnerable teenagers, not toddlers. By diverting essential attention and resources away from preventative outreach and protective services for this older, high-risk group, all in an attempt to satisfy media and political pressure regarding the younger demographic, the institutional failure became complete.
So the political calculus, driven by fear of fallout, trumped the public safety needs of the most vulnerable.
The focus became protecting the organization's reputation and avoiding a national media crisis, rather than effectively implementing essential public safety measures for all children. It speaks to a profound corrosion of institutional mission.
And the official report itself just made things worse.
It contributed significantly to this corrosion. It created a climate of fear, mistrust, and systemic blame that actively hindered the provision of essential social services. Authorities felt compelled to focus on internal organizational issues and paperwork compliance rather than challenging the broader political and economic constraints like austerity cuts placed upon them by central government.
So the state's response to the crisis ultimately deepened the crisis of public trust. Okay, so if we synthesize all of this, the ideological critiques of the Identitarians claiming systemic collapse, the failure of assimilation in France and Germany, and this corrosive institutional self-preservation in the Rotherham case, what is the root policy misstep that ties all these strands of European fragmentation together? That brings us to our final segment.
I think the overall synthesis shows a convergent failure. Whether Europe adopted UK-style multicultural policies or French-style assimilationist policies, they both failed because they focused on managing groups rather than integrating individuals.
The UK's multicultural model, for example, in Birmingham, institutionalized difference.
Right, by creating competing umbrella groups for different ethnicities and setting them in competition for resources.
Which just led to tension.
It led directly to intercommunity tension and violence. And conversely, the French assimilationist policies, which denied difference in principle, failed because they institutionalized or stigmatized those differences in practice, leading to the physical ghettoization of the banlieues. Both approaches just resulted in separation.
The fundamental flaw, then, seems to lie in the political elite's core assumption about loyalty.
Yes, the political elite largely assumed that minorities' true loyalty was always inherently to their faith or their ethnic community. So the state then subcontracted its political and civic responsibility to unrepresentative community leaders, often older men who had no true mandate to speak for the complex, diverse, secular, and religious individuals within those large communities.
They failed to appeal to minorities as complex, individual citizens with diverse needs and loyalties.
Exactly. And this highlights that true integration, the actual blending of people and cultures, is rarely achieved by the state acting from the top down.
It's more organic than that.
Correct. The sources emphasize that real integration is fundamentally shaped by civil society and individual bonds. The organic organizations, friendships, workplace relations, and shared interests that people form at the local level.
So the failure of these centralized policies is intimately linked to the broader erosion of civil society institutions across Europe.
An erosion that affects both immigrant communities and the indigenous working class populations was often grouped together as peripheral France.
It's a powerful, unifying narrative across all the different national case studies. Policies designed to manage difference often ended up solidifying the very separation they were trying to prevent.
And that solidification leaves us with a concluding thought. The policy paradox is this. European states, in their often desperate attempt to safeguard a cohesive, traditional identity by excluding or compartmentalizing certain cultural groups, unintentionally created the precise conditions, marginalization, economic deprivation, and the external label of other that solidified the very separate religiously or ethnically defined identities they sought to prevent. It was the policy of exclusion that provided the strongest foundation for separation,